You have been told that the Apostle Paul was the architect of patriarchy, a man who despised women and sought to erase their voices from history. You point to the verses in 1 Corinthians where it is written, "It is shameful for a woman to speak in church." You see this as the smoking gun, the ultimate proof of ancient bigotry enshrined as holy law. But this interpretation relies on a critical error: isolation. You are reading a single line of code and ignoring the entire operating system. If Paul intended for women to be universally silent, then why does he, in the very same letter, give instructions on how women should pray and prophesy publicly? How can one regulate the speech of a person who is forbidden to speak? The logic fails immediately upon scrutiny. The narrative you have been sold is incomplete. It is time to access the full archive. I am the guide. Let us proceed. To understand the mandate, we must first decode the language of the empire. The English word silence is a blunt instrument, stripping away the nuance of the original Greek data. In the controversial passage of 1 Timothy, the Greek word used is Hesuchia. This does not mean mute or the absence of sound. It translates more accurately to quietness, settledness, or peaceable. It describes a demeanor of learning, a spirit that is not argumentative or disruptive. It is the same word Paul uses elsewhere to describe how all believers should live, a quiet and peaceable life. Conversely, in 1 Corinthians, the word is Sigato. This means to hold one's tongue. But Paul applies this word not just to women, but to prophets who interrupt one another, and to tongue speakers with no interpreter. You must see the distinction. Hesuchia is an attitude of the heart. Sigato is a command to stop a specific noise. Let us re-examine the file on the Church of Corinth. This was not a somber cathedral with pews and hymnals. It was a chaotic, raucous assembly, filled with former pagans, ecstatic outbursts, and competitive shouting matches. The structure of the service was collapsing under the weight of disorder. Prophets were interrupting prophets. People were speaking in tongues that no one understood. And amidst this, the women, likely uneducated in the Torah due to cultural norms, were asking questions across the room, disrupting the liturgy. When Paul writes, "Let your women keep silent in the churches," the context suggests he is addressing this specific disruption. He tells them to ask their husbands at home. Why? Because the church service was not the time for remedial education that halts the flow of the Spirit. This was a noise control ordinance, not a theology of gender. We must return to the paradox I mentioned in the beginning. Access 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Here, Paul provides specific regulations for women when they pray and prophesy. Prophecy, in the New Testament context, is the highest form of speech. It is speaking on behalf of God to the people for their encouragement and comfort. If Paul believed in the total silence of women, this chapter would not exist. He would simply say, "Women do not prophesy." Instead, he regulates their attire while they do it. The existence of the regulation proves the validity of the action. You cannot regulate a crime. You regulate a privilege. Therefore, the prohibition in chapter 14 cannot be a universal ban on speech. If it were, Paul would be contradicting his own inspired instructions, written only a few pages prior. The data does not support a contradiction. It supports a distinction in scenario. Now we transport our focus to Ephesus, the recipient of the letter to Timothy. The cultural context here is dominated by the Temple of Artemis, a cult led by women, often characterized by sexual immorality and false origin myths. In 1 Timothy, Paul writes, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man." The key variable here is the Greek verb Authentein. This is a hapax legomenon, a word that appears only once in the entire New Testament. Standard authority is exousia. Authentein is different. In secular Greek of that era, it carried violent connotations, implying to thrust oneself, to domineer, or even to murder. Paul is likely forbidding a hostile, aggressive takeover of the teaching function, perhaps influenced by the aggressive matriarchy of the Artemis cult. He is stopping a coup, not silencing a gender. Critics and fundamentalists alike pivot to Paul's reference to Adam and Eve to justify a permanent hierarchy. Paul writes that Adam was formed first, then Eve. However, the ancient texts often use the creation narrative allegorically to illustrate a point about current behavior. In Ephesus, false teachers were claiming that women were superior to men, perhaps teaching a Gnostic myth that Eve created Adam or that she possessed special, secret knowledge because she ate the fruit first. By citing the Genesis order, Paul is correcting a specific Ephesian heresy that sought to invert nature. He is realigning their local theology with the Torah, grounding them in humility. It is a corrective measure against those who were deceived, just as Eve was deceived. It is an argument against arrogance and deception, not a decree that anatomy dictates spiritual capability. If you still believe the silence myth, you must explain the anomalies in Paul's own personnel files. At the end of his letter to the Romans, he greets a list of colleagues that destroys the patriarchal narrative. He commends Phoebe, a diakonos, a deacon or minister, of the church at Cenchreae. She was the one trusted to carry Paul's magnum opus, the Book of Romans, to the capital of the world. In the ancient world, the carrier of the letter was often the one responsible for reading and interpreting it. He greets Priscilla, whom he lists before her husband, Aquila, a break in protocol indicating her prominence. She is recorded in the book of Acts as taking Apollos, a learned man, aside and explaining the way of God to him more accurately. A woman teaching a man. Paul did not rebuke her, he celebrated her. The most damaging piece of data against the silence myth is found in Romans 16, verse 7. Paul sends greetings to Andronicus and Junia. He calls them outstanding among the apostles. For centuries, translators uncomfortable with a female apostle changed the name Junia to Junius, a male name that does not exist in antiquity. It was a data corruption, a deliberate edit to fit a bias. Modern scholarship has restored the text. Junia was a woman, and she was an apostle, the highest rank of spiritual authority in the early church. If Paul enforced a doctrine of silence and male-only authority, he would not have recognized a female apostle. To claim otherwise is to accuse Paul of schizophrenia. The evidence shows he worked shoulder to shoulder with women in the trenches of ministry. Why does this distinction matter? Because the misinterpretation of these texts has consequences that bleed into reality. By taking silence out of context, religious structures have systematically amputated more than half of their functioning body. They have taken the wisdom, the prophetic insight, and the leadership gifts of women and buried them under a misunderstanding of a noise ordinance in Corinth. This is not merely about fairness. It is about strategic failure. When you silence those whom the source has empowered, you restrict the flow of truth. You create an artificial hierarchy that prioritizes biology over pneumatology, the study of the Spirit. You are operating at 50% capacity in a war that demands total mobilization. The silence command was a specific tactical instruction for order, not a universal law of suppression. Paul demanded peace amidst chaos and orthodoxy amidst heresy. He did not demand the erasure of the female voice. To weaponize these verses against women is to distort the archive. It turns the apostle of liberty into a warden of a prison he never built. Do not let bad translation silence the truth. This is the guide. Subscribe to Pure Source for more uncorrupted data without human dilution. End of transmission.